I turn my mic on. So I would like to call to order the Rail Service and Community Enhancement Committee meeting, also known as RSCE, of the North County Transit District for October 13th, 2022. This ad hoc committee was approved by the NCTD board at its July 21st, 2022 meeting to support the advancement of projects such as quiet zones, grade separated crossings, and other quality of life improvements along NCTD's rail corridors and on the coast and inland. The board's expectation is that this committee would facilitate discussion on these topics and make recommendations to the board in terms of regional strategy. In light of the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, now is the time for us to work towards implementing improvements that positively impact the communities we serve. Before we begin, I would like to inform members of the public who may be viewing the meeting on the district's YouTube page that in order to make a public comment during the meeting, you must connect to the meeting using the Zoom link provided on the agenda. You must also register with the clerk by sending an email to clerk@nctd.org with a name and or phone number and which item you would like to speak on. I would like to ask Suhil Rodriguez, clerk of the board, to call the roll.
Yes, Madam Chair. Chair Contreras.
Present.
Board Member Hensey.
Here.
Board Member Bhat Patel.
Here.
Board Member Desmond.
Here.
That completes the roll call.
Thank you so much. And Suhil will now provide a safety brief and review evacuation procedures, which makes a lot more sense when you're in the building. So.
Thank you, Chair. In case of an emergency, I will dial 911. In case of an evacuation, please take the stairs. Do not use the elevators. Once cleared of the building, do not re-enter unless cleared to do so by emergency personnel. There are fire extinguishers and first aid kits on each floor of this building. There is a portable defibrillator on the first floor and staff on hand trained on CPR procedures if needed. This concludes my safety brief.
Thank you. And Suhil, are there any changes to the agenda?
No, Madam Chair.
All right. And Suhil, do we have any remaining public comments?
No, Madam Chair.
All right. At this time, we are ending the public registration to speak on this item. Am I ahead of the schedule here? No. Okay. Before we get into specific items on the agenda for this meeting, I would like to outline meeting protocols to make this meeting as efficient as possible. First, please hold your comments and or questions until after the agenda item has been presented. Second, when the time comes for board member comments or questions, please raise your hand and I will call on you in the order received. So we're going to get to our presentations. Our first item on the agenda will review the calendar year 2022 through 2023 RSCE Committee Work Plan. Lillian Daugherty, Director of Planning and Development, will introduce this item. You have our attention, Lillian. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Chair and RSCE committee members. In accordance with Board Policy 3, an ad hoc committee is established for a specific purpose or need. This committee was established to evaluate and discuss opportunities for quiet zone, grade separation, and other quality of life improvements. The anticipated term of this committee is through 2023, which is why we are looking at calendar years 22 and 23. We are asking this committee to adopt a 2-year work plan necessary to meet the objectives of this ad hoc committee. Next slide, please. In this calendar year, we are proposing for today that we will hear the initial work plan, as well as laws, regulations, and policies applicable to rail safety and community enhancement projects, and that we would also receive a presentation regarding the FRA and other grant programs and the funding availabilities in this unprecedented time. In November of this year, we anticipate that we are proposing to receive a presentation by SANDAG on the regional plan, objectives, or plans regarding the Sprinter and Coaster Railway line, so focused in those areas, as well as an update on what NCTD is doing regarding signal optimization, wireless crossings, and quiet zones. A presentation on our grant strategies relating to the Sprinter grade separated crossings, as well as a presentation by the City of Encinitas on their El Portal undercrossing project. Next slide, please. Next year, we will start the year with presentations focused on the benefits and risks of at grade versus grade separated crossings, as well as a presentation on an update on our efforts to outline the process to develop and implement a quiet zone through the Quiet Zone Roadmap study. In March of next year, we will then have our city members, our working group members, present the city and county priorities for the Sprinter and then subsequently the coaster lines. Next slide, please. In April, we will hear presentations on case studies regarding the Oceanside Quiet Zone implementation and a case study from the city of Carlsbad, as well as our Sandag partners on the Carlsbad Village Trench project. At that time, we will also kick off a regional opportunities discussion to identify those priorities that NCTD should be reviewing. In June, we will conclude with a discussion of those regional opportunities, a much more robust discussion regarding our quiet zone, grade separation, and wayside horns, and other rail safety projects that we believe are critical for NCTD to pursue. That meeting will conclude with recommendations for a full board consideration. And with that, that concludes our recommendations. Next slide. We are recommending at this time that the RSCE committee provide feedback and adopt the proposed calendar years 22 and 23 work plans per board policy number 3. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Do we have any public comments for this agenda item?
No, Madam Chair.
All right, so at this time, we are ending the public registration to speak on this item. Are there any questions from the board?
So let's see, so do I have to hold this button down? Okay, so thanks for, I don't have to hold it. Okay, so thank you for that presentation, Lillian. I'm really excited this committee is formed and happy to be part of it. As you know, in Encinitas, we have so many priorities, and I think 2 of the top ones, the quiet zone and rail crossings, are the top ones, but this committee also references other quality of life improvements that we might be considering. What would be an example? Is it like rail trails or lighting, or what are some of those other things?
All of those potential projects. We've heard from some of the cities that they're interested in trails, potential landscaping improvements, all of those types of projects would be considered as we go through this process.
Okay, great. And then if the city of Encinitas, we've already kicked off, we've at least allocated some money to pursue rail cross or quiet zones. And so I'm just curious to know how we plan to be working with each of the partner cities. Is it going to be in public here at this forum, or are there individual working groups with each city that will be planned?
Thank you for that question. We have established a working group level comprised of city and county staff members. We are meeting in advance of each of these committee meetings to share information, answer their questions as they are looking at individual jurisdictional priorities. So whether it's rail trail, quiet zone, wayside horns, they're better understanding the requirements and processes that are needed to bring those projects into fruition, and also understanding opportunities where partnerships between the jurisdictions would be key to bringing those projects forward. So we are working through regularly scheduled working level meetings.
Any other questions from board members? We're good. Okay, so it says that we want to adopt the proposed calendar, but then it also says that this is an informational item only, so no motion required? All right. All right, well, I move to adopt the proposed calendar year 2022 through 23 work plan per NCTD Board Policy number 3.
I'll second.
All right, and if we could call for the roll, please.
Board Chair Contreras,
Aye.
Vice Chair Hensy,
Yes.
Board Member Patel,
Aye.
Board Member Desmond.
Aye.
On the motion of Board Member Contreras, seconded by Board Member Desmond, to receive the calendar year 2022-2023 RSCE Committee Work Plan, motion passes.
Awesome, and really great questions. Thank you. The next item on our agenda is to receive a presentation on the law, regulations, and policies that are applicable to rail safety and community enhancement projects. Devin, is it Rouse? Strategic Rail Advisor, and Lillian Dodry, Director of Planning and Development, will review item number 2.
Thank you, Chair. Today presenting with me is Mr. Devin Rouse. I will give him an opportunity to introduce himself and provide a little bit about his background.
Are you driving this or do you? All right, thanks, Phil. Logistics first, right? So good afternoon to the members of the committee here. Yeah, as you know, my name is Devin Rouse. I am a consultant for North County, but pertinent to this discussion in this meeting, the reason I'm here is because prior to that, I spent over a decade as a regulator with the Federal Railroad Administration. And so it just made sense that for a presentation of this nature, that it would be helpful if I could give you a little bit of background in terms of how rail in particular, especially coaster and sprinter, are regulated and how laws, regulations, and different authorities interact with decisions that are made on the railroad. So you can go to the next slide, Suhail. Did you want to talk about this real quick?
So our mission at NCTD is to serve our communities in a safe manner, but not just in how we operate our trains and buses, but also in how we manage and modify our rail corridors. Next slide, please. Oversight of the rail corridor involves agencies at the federal, state, and local levels, as well as industry partners working together to collaborate and identify those processes and procedures that keep our riders and our communities safe. Devin?
And I promise we're not going to keep passing it back and forth on every slide. We're not that organized. But to give you a sense here, the rail industry is one of the oldest regulated industries in this country, as many of you know. And so that creates a pretty unique environment in what we're talking about today. Obviously, there are the government agencies that we know of that have a role here, both at the federal and state level. But it's also important to note that the industry itself has a lot of self-regulating elements within it. And that's due just in course of time that we have standards and other procedures that as a railroad, NCTD is expected to follow. And many of those standards predate the existence of any of those government agencies listed. And so that's why we've got these layer upon layer of requirements that have just built up over 200 years of railroading. And so let me just say this, having been a regulator for as long as I was, it's a convoluted process when it comes to who has what authority and on what issue. So the goal here is not that anyone becomes an expert on laws and regulations and rail safety. There is no simple flow chart. So if we go through this and you find yourself going, wow, this is really complex. It is. So that's part of the reason for having this discussion. You don't have to have all the answers today, but as we move forward, it's to give you an appreciation of some of the things we'll have to deal with on different projects that you might undertake. In particular, the biggest takeaway that would probably be or should be mentioned here is that NCTD is a railroad. Even though we're talking about projects on private railroad property, NCTD must still answer to many different agencies and parents, so to speak. So at the end of the day, it's really not the railroad's decision on many of these issues. There are other agencies that have to give the final okay or the final approval. It's kind of like doing something in your own house. If you want to go build a deck, you still have to go get permits typically. You may still need homeowners association approval. So it's not as simple as just saying, hey, we're going to go out and do this. And the property owner just needs to give its okay. So if there's any takeaway, I think that would be an important one as we go through these slides. Suhail. Now, despite the fact that there's so many different elements, agencies, and standards involved, there is a hierarchy. And this is what makes railroads in particular a bit unique from other modes of transportation, whether it's aviation or probably most similarly rail transit in the form of MTS down in San Diego or BART or any of the insular rail transit systems, in that there is a heavy federal involvement, as you may know. And so that really drives a lot of what happens on a railroad property, is making sure we comply with the laws and the regulations that the federal government has. And these laws and regulations hold more weight than many of the other elements as you go down this pyramid here. And that's important to note. We may not always have to follow every single ARIMA standard or APTA standard, but we are expected to comply with federal regulations and laws. So it does have a lot of weight in the decisions of what we do. And what's unique about rail in particular is the fact that that federal role is much larger than you would see in, let's say, transit. And the reason for that is just, again, the history and the artifact of what railroads do in this country. You'll see federal regulations supersede even state and local requirements. But for a time, that top pyramid element never existed. And so the reason that element was added was when railroads first started, they were primarily state and local affairs, going between one town or another. And as the industry grew, you saw a lot more different variations on themes in terms of how safety was approached and how you addressed certain issues. So the federal government eventually had to step in and say, okay, we need some common approach to safety. All trains for that matter should have air brakes, for example. And so as the industry really took off and started to grow beyond the borders of one town to another, and especially to state borders, it became more critical to have some level of federal control. The other thing that happened at the same time is that since these were primarily local endeavors, state and local governments had a lot of investment in these companies. And so you started to see states pass laws and requirements that help protect those investments. In fact, Ohio by itself had its own gauge requirement, gauges the distance between your two rails. So you can imagine if you're trying to go from one state to another and you had to change the width of your rail, that causes a problem. And so again, the reason we have this federal preemption, if you will, is to kind of combat that element where we had different requirements every time you went across the state line, because it was impeding interstate commerce. And so that is the main driver for a lot of what we do in the heavy rail industry, like Coaster, like Sprinter, which is different from insular systems like BART per se. Next slide. So, yes, in the early days, Congress would pass a law to kind of control this. And then as it became more of an interstate commerce issue, eventually they created the ICC, which was the primary regulator for a long time. It wasn't until 1966 that FRA and USDOT really stepped into the role that we have today. And that might come as a surprise, knowing how long this industry has been around, that the primary regulator today has only been around since 1966. But that's just an artifact of how things have evolved over time. But as it stands today, the FRA is the primary safety authority. So they have preemptive authority over most matters of railroad safety, things like track standards, operations, equipment standards, signal systems. And that's how it stands today. And we'll talk a little bit more about that relationship with the state here in a couple slides. How is FRA really directly involved with NCTD? Again, as a safety enforcement agency, 2/3 of the FRA are agents who are in the field, officers who can actually write defects, even cite civil penalties to railroads or even individuals if it's that egregious. So that's the primary function. And this is, again, something that sets railroads apart from other transit modes where you do not have that interaction. You may have the state safety oversight, is the primary regulator, and they may or may not have any authority to issue citations against a railroad. But in this case, it's a very different world. You have inspectors that are on the track any given day looking at different things and how the railroad operates. There's also safety outreach, and this is important for this committee here because we do have a new organization within FRA looking at grade crossing and trespasser outreach, where there's a person responsible for every region that is kind of your go-to contact to help manage issues or answer questions as it relates to things like quiet zones or crossings. And then research and development and grant programs are also something that's an element within FRA, but certainly not as big as the safety element itself, the reason it was created, but a growing element, especially with the current bipartisan law and all the money that's out there now. The grants department in particular is growing, and maybe something we'll probably be engaged in a lot as we look at what opportunities might be out there to fund some of these enhancement projects. One thing to note, North County as it stands, both rail operations and the track that they run on are part of the U.S. General Railroad Network. So that means they are beholden to the FRA regulations without a doubt. That's, again, different from what you might see with MTS down south for most of its operations, or BART or any other light rail or rail transit system. Coaster is what we would consider a fully compliant system. Sprinter's a bit unique because it is sort of a transit system on the general network where are allowed to do that because of waivers that were issued by the federal government in order to as long as there are certain mitigations to maintain the safety of that operation. That's a story for another day, though. And we don't need to get into that here. It's just worth noting because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter about the operation. It's the fact that the track is part of the general network. That means we would still need to go to FRA if it's anything that's under their jurisdiction and have their approval. Next slide. So I won't spend much time on this, but this is in effect, the Bible for railroads is this Code of Federal Regulations. And this addresses everything from ADA requirements to track standards to even things like noise emissions and locomotive emissions from the EPA side. Next slide. Now, this is important again, because where there is a regulation, that means the federal government has the final say in terms of whether or not we can do certain things. And a good example of this, and probably the most pertinent for this committee, is the horn rule. Now, full disclosure here, I was not involved in writing this rule. So if you have stones and feel like casting them at me, please do not. But this is one of the situations where, again, you had state and local ordinances that really drove how horns were used at crossings. And over time, after I think it was Florida passed an ordinance on how horns were to be used in a global quiet zone for all the crossings, there was a study done that was performed that found about accidents increased about over threefold. So 3 times more accidents were occurring after that prohibition was put in place. And so that's just, there's a lot more to that. There's a lot more that was looked at that fact, but this kind of illustrates the point where some uniformity was needed. And they felt that by having all these different local and state level ordinances on how horns were used and how crossings were treated, there needed to be more control, because crossing accidents and trespassing issues are the most important elements when it comes to safety. They are the statistics that are the highest, right? They are the most, those are what drive safety. I mean, there's certainly other types of defects and issues that have accidents, but when you look at safety of the railroad, it's grade crossing accidents and trespasser accidents that are number 1 and 2. Next slide. So that's a little bit of the federal perspective and kind of how we are where we are today. I'll turn it over to Lillian to talk a little bit more about the state and its involvement.
And so a little bit of interesting California history. So the CPUC was established in 1911, the California Public Utilities Commission. It was originally established as the Railroad Commission, which really sort of signifies the importance of the rail early in California history. Its role did expand over time, and it was renamed to the California Public Utilities Commission in 1946. Today, its Rail Safety Division carries out the CPUC mission noted here on the rail line. So I'm just going to read this because of the significance of this in the Public Utilities Code. So no public road, highway, or street shall be constructed across the track of any railroad corporation at grade without having first secured the permission of the commission. The CPUC is specifically charged with the responsibility to review and approve the implementation of new crossings or modifications to existing crossings. Next slide, please. And like the FRA, the CPUC also employs staff that enforce federal regulations. They are federally certified, so they are able to enforce federal regulations as well as ones that are formulated here in the state to ensure compliance with both federal and state laws. So not only is NCTD under the oversight of the CPUC, but it's also anyone that shares our tracks. So that includes BNSF, Amtrak, and other rail providers in other parts of the state. Important to note that NCTD does work collaboratively with them. So if we do have projects coming forward, we immediately engage to get their thoughts on our proposed projects. And once we do have a city or county that proposes a project, we immediately start that engagement so that we're all working together to share that information. For crossings, specifically, we do this. We do schedule site-specific visits, looking at the unique circumstances at each crossing. Devin can go into more of this shortly, but it's really important to note that each crossing location is very, very specific because the criteria factors change at each location. Next slide, please. And here at NCTD, we have our own policies, board policy number 18. And this brings it back to how we NCTD will work with the communities and the jurisdictions to bring these projects to fruition. We are here essentially to support these projects that the local jurisdictions decide to bring forward. Because local jurisdictions are in the best position to determine what projects are the most beneficial to their communities. We depend on them to design and plan these projects and bring them to us so that we can help bring them through the process. Next slide, please. Since one of the main focuses of this committee is how we interface with the railroad, and it's important to understand the relationships between the different authorities. Next slide. We did want to point out at least some of the public utilities codes illustrative only of the point that this is not there's not just one law, one policy, one book. There's many laws, many books, many policies, and many industry standards that govern how we modify or change our railroads. Devin?
Yeah, and we've already talked about the federal role and especially the Horn Rule and other areas where it has precedent in terms of its requirements. But what's important to note here is when it comes to the design of crossings and some of the final decisions, state really has a very large role in that as well. In fact, section 1202, I'm not going to read it all right out here for you, but this really summarizes that fact that it's really up to the CPUC to really have the determination in where crossings can be located, how they're designed, the installation and operation and maintenance of different protection devices that might be at those locations. So now we're starting to get a little more deep, right? There's more, it's more than just the federal, it's the state as well. And the next slide. And as you can expect, there's rules and requirements as you go through. There's over 7 general orders that apply to rail crossings, 5 rules of practice. But perhaps most importantly, as most people are familiar who have worked on crossings before, is compliance with the manual on uniform traffic control devices, particularly chapter 8, which addresses rail and light rail transit crossings. Next slide. So we talked, all right, that's probably not too terribly confusing. That makes sense, right? But wait, there's more, right? This is the infomercial picture. As you talk about the design of crossings, you also get the state involved in the Caltrans level, because they're the ones that maintain the manual of uniform traffic control devices. And even in their highway design manual, I've put a little excerpt here, they also talk about their role as it relates to crossings. In fact, that, you know, it says here specifically, ideally rail crossings of transportation facilities shall be grade separated, All rail crossings, though, are to be approved by the district director. Okay, so now we've got a federal role in certain elements. We've got CPUC and they're involved in California as well. And if that's not involved or complex enough, there's also potential for another federal agency to be involved because even though California has its own manual for how you design railroad crossings, that manual has to largely comply with the federal manual on uniform traffic control devices. So they can't deviate too much. And if they do, and this has actually happened in the past, where the state may say, okay, this is good. We like what you're doing here. We think you can deviate from the requirements in the manual. FHWA has actually stepped and said, no, we don't agree with that. You need to follow our rules, our requirements, and has threatened to withhold funding in certain instances. So you can see this vicious circle we've gone through from the federal to the state, and then we're back to the federal level. Just to give you an illustration again, that when we talk about these programs, it's not to scare anybody. I mean, it is involved, it is complex, but the idea here is that if we understand the process we have to work through and who we have to work with, and we engage with those entities early, we can make these programs a success. So it's all a matter about managing expectations and early engagement. The worst thing you can do as a railroad or any other entity for that matter is try to avoid reaching out to these entities and just ask for forgiveness later. It doesn't work in the railroad environment. It just is not an option because what you will get is not something you will like if that happens and they find out. So yes, it's complex. Yes, it's convoluted. That's, it's just the nature of the beast and the history of railroading, but it can be managed and you can accomplish your goals if we work together on trying to achieve those. So next slide. I think that's pretty much it. Yes, the synthesis of FRA and CPUC regulations. I think I've touched on this with some examples before, but for Lori's benefit, again, there is a hierarchy. We do have to remember that even if at a local and a state level, there's agreement and we've reached a design or something we believe is safe, it still has to go through a process at the federal level. And one thing to point out that, well, there's two things to point out. One, they may not agree with that, but two, the time frame that's involved. Anything involving the federal approval, you're going to add months to a process, even years in some cases. So again, this is about managing expectations. If we want a quiet zone or you want to design a crossing that eventually is intended to become a quiet zone, we need to set those expectations up, talk to these agencies, make sure we understand what it's going to take from not only the state level, but also the federal level, so we can work towards those goals and achieve them within a reasonable time frame.
So the relationship between NCTD, our cities, and the county is a significant one. And while our primary objective is to move people between destinations, we are also here to support the goals of the communities that we serve. Work in the right-of-way, as we've noted, is fairly complicated, with many different agencies having a role and responsibility in that discussion. But the bottom line here is that we are here to help guide these projects through the process, or processes as it may be, to provide information and feedback where we can for the successful implementation of those projects that maintain safety and community enjoyment. At this time, next slide, please. I'd like to open the floor for questions.
And do we have any public comments on this agenda item?
No, Madam Chair.
All right. At this time, we are ending the public registration to speak on this item. And are there any questions from the board?
Thanks for the presentation.
I do have a
Sure.
question. So I'm just seeking a little bit more clarification on what seems to be a contradiction in that the quiet zone does not require state approval, but yet the CPUC is participating in the process along the whole way. Would you be able to explain that to me for the purpose of, it's just, the expectations are thoroughly set right now, and I understand that there's gonna be a lot that we're gonna have to do to get where we wanna go. But the reason I ask is because was able to talk to the folks at Oceanside who established their quiet zone. And I was trying to figure out, were their difficulties so long and onerous because they started at one time, didn't have all the funding together, and then it just took so long to dial in those last final things they needed to do for the quiet zone. So how can we approach this in a way where we are, we're doing it as quickly as we can, without maybe all the funding that we have at that time. So how do we get to work with the federal and the state together and progress in a timely way?
Well, to answer the first question, right, the relationship between the two, the ultimate decision to waive the federal requirement for horns, just the horn element, obviously is with the FRA. And they're looking at certain improvements and the demonstration of those improvements at locations to ensure a certain level of safety. Where CPUC and other entities from the state level and local level step in is that the FRA won't tell you how to orient gates or what colored paint to use or anything in that nature. That's within the state's perspective and their standards. So you need to follow their requirements to achieve a certain level of safety. The FRA is just going to make sure that you've complied with those state and local requirements, design requirements, and that the overall product has achieved a certain level of safety. Does that make sense from just that perspective? That the detailed design is at the state and local level, but the overall decision to relieve you from a federal requirements at the federal level?
Yeah, it does. And I think what I'm curious about is how much the state actually tells us what to do through that process, or how much the city or entity is just going to be kind of guessing at these things and hoping that we've achieved their requirement.
Yeah, and that's where engagement with the agency or the utility, public utility in this case, is really important. First, you want to understand what the federal requirement would be for a crossing. And mind you, new crossings and existing crossings are two different animals. So let's separate that out. But at the end of the day, the expectations that there's a certain level of protection, and there's models that they will run to see based on expected traffic, whether it's vehicular traffic or pedestrian traffic, and treatments around the railroad itself and other investments that are made to make sure people actually use the crossing and don't just walk anywhere else around it. Those all are looked at in the overall safety of that crossing itself, and some guidelines and expectations would be set from the federal level as to how to protect that crossing. But then it's a matter of working with CPUC to make sure, okay, what type of devices do we need to put up? What is the precise location of the crossing? And are we complying with the design requirements of the state itself? And so it's a parallel path, if you will, engagement with the FRA and seeing what their expectations are, but then taking those expectations from a performance level and translating it to the specification level per se, if you will, at the state standards, working with CPUC and Caltrans.
And this might just be, I don't know, you might not have the answer, but in your experience, do you think that there's, okay, so I know that we're trying to eliminate at-grade crossings for vehicles, but have you seen progress on at-grade crossings that are just for bikes and pedestrians looked at more favorably by the state and federal agency?
It's a loaded question. In general, as you may know, the normal perspective is we should be taking away crossings, not adding them. Now, having said that, it's a matter of the particulars. If the right investments are made and protection is put in place, you can make a situation safer than just having somebody cross anywhere they want to, right? But it's a matter of making those investments. If you just put up a crossing and some gates and all the person has to do is simply walk 2 feet over, go past it, and have you really achieved your end goal and made it safer? No, now you have something else to maintain. But if you look at it from the larger perspective and make sure that you manage the channeling of pedestrians or bike or anything else of that nature and force them to use that crossing, use it appropriately, then you could actually have some improvements, whereas before it was just trespassers on the railroad, if you will. That that's the best I can tell you on that. It all matters about the level of investment and that overall thought of what's the objective and are we achieving it by the design that we're putting in place.
And I have a question. Since, the Sprinter has this waiver, are there any potentials to lose that waiver if we start, because there's a lot of things we want to do on this corridor. So are they like two separate things, or is there potential to lose the waiver that we have?
That's a good question. And let me point this out. There's always a potential to lose a waiver, right? And most waivers are renewed every 5 years. There are some that are permanent, but largely we moved away from that and started capping everybody at 5 years. And the reason for that was because what we would find is that we would establish some requirements to maintain safety. And if we came back several years later, those requirements were not being met. And this actually extends to quiet zones, because we have found in the past, I keep saying I haven't gone through the complete detox process of not being a federal employee anymore. Over time, with crossings, there are requirements to maintain the warning devices and maintain the design around that crossing, again, to make sure people are channeling to use the crossing and using it appropriately. And we would find that those elements weren't being maintained. And so quiet zones have been pulled because of that as well. So there is no guarantee when it comes to waiver, right? It's like a blessing. All right, here you go. You can have relief, but you must follow these requirements. And if you don't, it's just going to be taken back and you'll be back into where you were before. Now, that doesn't mean that you're on some list and blacklist and can never get the waiver back. You'd have to go make progress and demonstrate that you've reachieve that level of safety and demonstrate that from that point forward, you will be able to maintain what you were expected to maintain in the first place. But that gives you a little bit of sense of how waivers are addressed.
And what year are we in our 5 years of a waiver, if that's what we have?
I think, no, don't quote me on this. We recently renewed it when I was still there, and I left as of December of this past year.
Okay.
So it hasn't been that. It's probably 2 or 3 years at this point. So it's going to be up. It's not up for renewal right this minute. But yeah, every 5 years it would come up and have to be renewed. But the waiver is pertinent to the elements that you're seeking relief from. So in this case, for the Sprinter, not to belabor this, but it's more based on the crashworthiness of the vehicles because they are based on European designs. And so the primary mitigation was temporal separation from freight. And so as long as that's being met, that waiver's in pretty good standing. Now, whether or not that's advantageous moving forward, especially as we look at replacing the Sprinter fleet, that's a discussion for another time that I may be involved with, but it's just for your benefit. The waiver and the renewal of it are pertinent to the matter at hand, right?
Okay. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, because if we ever wanted to try to expand service beyond the hours that we have it, we run into a lot of different issues. So I didn't know that the temporal piece was part of us being able to have this waiver. I didn't even know we had a waiver. So, and just the last question that I have, if everything goes right and with trying to get a quiet zone, what's the time frame from start to finish if everything goes right? So in a very conservative estimate.
Yeah, I wish I could give you that number. I really can't. What I can tell you is this. I mean, certainly you can take a sample of what's been done elsewhere, and you'll hear stories from anywhere from a few years to 10 years or more. What's important, not all crossings are created equal, for one, right? And I think it was mentioned earlier, funding's a big part of it. So yes, you want to make the improvements, but if you don't have funding and it takes 3 years to get the funding, that's a big driver for the timeline. Once the improvements are made, though, the only known process is that then you have to actually apply for that quiet zone and get it approved. And that involves somebody going out and doing a field audit making sure all the improvements are actually indeed in place and functioning and working. And then eventually that's going to be a brief to the safety board, which will then make a final decision. And that process on average we usually advise that that's anywhere from 4 to 6 months in and of itself. So take that chunk and put it over here and then backtrack from there what you would need to do in terms of coordinating with CPUC and FRA and any others, and say, what are those design requirements so that we can construct it that way, put it in place. But that brings up an important point, because that means for at least those 6 months, assuming everything is perfect and you open it up, the crossing appears overnight and it's there and it's protected, you could go up to 6 months having to have a horn there and until you get final approval of that quiet zone. So that's something to consider as well as you think about where you might want to put these and the impact that might have until that approval is received.
All right, well, thank you very much. And are there any other questions or comments from the board?
So just a clarifying question on that one. So even if we've got these crossings fully approved by the CPUC and they're looking good, it could be months before the federal government has the time to come out and approve it. So for those months, it's going to be the train sounding its horn every time it goes through.
Yes. Yeah. And that's, the federal government has administrative policies that it has to follow. And I'll be honest, I can't remember if the approval of quiet zones requires a public comment period, but generally when we issue waivers, there's a 45-day public comment period involved as well. So that right out the bat puts you 45 days in. And so then it's a matter of if the audit finding was clean, if there were any questions that the auditor had to come back and ask the city or the local jurisdiction and clear up before a final brief could be written and presented to the board. And then it's whenever the next board meeting is being held. So that could be, you make the next one or it's a month until the next one.
And that's only true for at grades. That wouldn't be the case for a grade separate.
Yeah, grade separated.
Right.
Yeah, no issue there in terms of approvals or quiet zones.
Thank you.
Sounds like we need to do a lot of grade separations. So.
That's a great segue to.
Perfect. Well, you know what? Since there's no other questions from the board and there's no vote required for this item, since it's informational only, we are going to move on to the last item on our agenda, and it's not 5 o'clock yet. So we're doing good. So the last item on our agenda will be to provide an overview of NCTD's grant programs and funding availability. Mary Dover, Governmental Affairs Officer, will review item number 3. Mary, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, board members. It's nice to see you all in person. As board member Contreras mentioned, I am the Government Affairs Officer for NCTD. I handle legislation and grant funding. Next slide, please, Suhail. As Lillian mentioned earlier, the purpose of the RSCE committee is to identify opportunities for NCTD to improve safety and make community enhancements along the corridor, the Coaster and Sprinter Rail corridor specifically. This includes grade separations, which could be for highway rail and pathway rail, pedestrian bicycle crossings, which could be underpasses or trenches of either the roadway or the rail corridor. Community enhancements, like Lillian touched on, could be active transportation improvements for pedestrian bicycles or for vehicular infrastructure. This could also be walkways up to the stations or crossings or anything like that. Also could be making ADA improvements to the rail corridor stations and things like that, and also transit-oriented development around each station. Next slide, please. A lot of this presentation, and please forgive me, is going to be very similar to what you heard from the discretionary grant strategy in September, just with a more rail focus. So there are historic levels of funding at both the federal and state level. Last year, the federal government passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which authorized historic funding levels for the next 5 fiscal years. The California state budget was also passed earlier this year, includes $1.8 billion for transit projects just in Southern California, and also $1.049 billion for the active transportation program, and 350 million for grade separation projects. As I mentioned at the September board meeting, some of these funding levels are subject to future negotiations. If Congress or the state legislature decides to authorize or appropriate levels lower than what's authorized, they could do so, but they could also do it higher than what's authorized. Next slide, please. And these slides are just to depict the massive increases in funding for both rail and transit at the federal levels. Next slide, please. These are some of the key programs for rail related improvements. I won't talk about any of them, but one thing that I did want to note is that the 350 million for grade separation from the state was included as part of the transit and intercity rail capital program. They just issued the guidelines last month or earlier this month, I believe. And they, so sometimes they'll do that. They'll issue a combined notice of funding opportunity or call for projects that includes different pots of funding. Next slide, please. These are some of the FRA grant programs that could be available for NCTD and its member cities to seek funding from. What's important to note is that some of these programs are for projects that have intercity rail benefits, and that means Amtrak. So some of these programs, projects on the coaster corridor are only eligible. We've made the mistake of trying to go for Sprinter funding in the past and mentioned that since Amtrak doesn't operate on the Sprinter corridor, not eligible for the funding. Probably most pertinent to this discussion is the railroad crossing elimination. It is a new program that was authorized under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and it provides around 600 million annually. Next slide, please. The Office of the Secretary of Transportation also has grant programs. The MEGA and RAISE programs are a little bit more flexible in that the MEGA program provides funding for really large scale projects that are difficult to fund. And then the RAISE program has more broad guidelines in the sense that it could be eligible for a wider range of projects than some of the other programs that are hyper focused on one particular issue. Next slide, please. One in particular that I also wanted to mention is the Reconnecting Communities pilot program. I believe it's new under the IIJA, but don't quote me on that. NCTD, at least in this most recent notice of funding opportunity, was not eligible for funding. I think the goal of this was to have cities identify and local jurisdictions and states identify what transportation infrastructure in their areas was creating a barrier between communities. NCTD can be a partner on the application, but I think the goal was for communities to determine whether it's a highway or a rail line or any other piece of transportation infrastructure that is segmenting communities. This provides funding to mitigate that. Thanks. It wasn't on the grid, and I don't know why. I pulled that from the FRA website, but I can send around information on that particular grant program. It did just close this year's, but there will be an FY23 one that'll probably come out next year.
And just real quick, so these projects have to be shovel-ready projects, essentially?
No, they have
They can be dreams?
kind of. So they have different pots of funding within this larger pot of funding. Usually 8 or 10% for planning, and that can be for the design, study, environmental permitting of the project. And then there is the rest of the pot for construction. It can be a dream, but it's helpful if the project is included in like Sandag's regional plan or the CMCP for the state of California, things like that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And these are FTA specific programs that might be eligible for this committee's concern. The pilot program for transit oriented development. This is a pot of funding, not necessarily for the construction of transit oriented development, but more of the planning, whether it's land use policy changes, studies to determine how the transit oriented development could be most successful. There's also the All Stations Accessibility Program, provides funding to bring rail stations up to compliance with the ADA. Thankfully, all of NCTD's stations are ADA compliant. So in future iterations of this program, we might be eligible for funding, but we didn't determine in this past cycle that there was anything that we could apply for funding for. Next slide, please. And then the active transportation program is a state program. As I mentioned, there's a little over 1 billion in the pot currently. A little confusing because entities can apply for funding directly to the state for this program, but also Sandag has about 60 million, I think, this year that they can allocate to projects within San Diego and Imperial counties, I believe. And the goal of this program is to encourage the use of active transportation, walking, biking, things like that. And with that, I will welcome any questions or feedback regarding the available funding opportunities.
Thank you. So are there, do we have any public comments on this agenda item?
No, Madam Chair.
Thank you. At this time, we are ending the public registration to speak on this item. And are there any questions from the board?
I do have a question. So with that state active transportation funding, I think that more affluent communities tend not to get it. And I think that's because they look at the community as a whole. Is that different for the pot of money that Sandag has?
That's a really good question. I'll have to find that out. I'll do a little bit more digging and get back to you.
And I think like in the case of Encinitas as a whole, it's a very affluent community, but some of these areas where we're looking to put more investment in, there's some pockets of low income, which is why I think at one time we were able to get a state grant for the El Portal undercrossing. So I'm just hopeful that we can look at the smaller level and not just the whole community, because we do have, you know, some areas that require more investment.
Right. And there is, we've made the case for some of our grant applications that NCTD's service area as a whole is interconnected. And so disadvantaged communities in other parts of the service area will benefit from some of the improvements that are made in more affluent communities. So we do look at that when we do grant applications as well, tying it all together, whether there's a bus route that runs through Encinitas that goes somewhere else, things like that.
Yeah, thank you.
I had a question.
Yeah, sure.
Well, thanks. And I just I have to bring this up because in the county, I'm looking primarily at the Buena Creek Sprinter Station there, perhaps. And I've heard potentially that's going to be grade separated there one way or the other. And I don't know if any of these grant dollars, and I know we're looking between the county and NCTD on opportunities for dollars. I'm trying to get the roadway system working better there along with the transit with the Buena Creek Station, so we can get housing in that area. So it pencils out for people to come in, particularly affordable housing or any types of housing right now at this point. So I don't know, do you see potentially grant opportunities for that type of project, or that, I guess there's going to be grade separation. Do you have any idea what that might look like and what dollars might be sought after?
Yeah, you're reading our minds. I don't want to spoiler alert
You're doing this tomorrow, right? Okay.
So the next committee meeting, Lillian kind of touched on this. We'll go further into depth on a grant application that we just submitted for Buena Creek.
Great.
So I'll have a fleshed out and in-depth presentation on that next month.
Well, that's wonderful, because then I can push the county to get moving on the other.
The county is working on being our partner with that. So
Perfect.
they I think took your directive at the Board of Supervisors meeting and has been very helpful in getting us information.
Well, the one thing, it's the only rail transit stop we have in the unincorporated areas, and I'm trying to say, well, let's set the example and put some housing next to the transit area. And but it takes some infrastructure work to get it done. So thank you.
And yeah, to kind of go off of the Buena Creek Station, I'm 100% supportive of trying to do something at that station. And I'm curious because even though we may be ADA compliant within the transit stations themselves, the surrounding infrastructure, how far out can we go to be ADA compliant?
Yeah, that's a great, just in the parameters of the All Stations Accessibility Program, it was geared towards the like New York's where they only have stairs going down to the subway stations, things like that. I think that was the goal of the program, but there are other a lot of the grant programs really encourage multimodal improvements. And so when we tie in, okay, this is a improvement specifically to the rail corridor, but we're going to improve bus stop infrastructure down the way, that strengthens the application too. So as long as we have partnership with the entity that controls that roadway where the bus stop maybe that needs the ADA improvement, then that's something we could go after grant funding for too.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, in at the Buena Creek Station, most of the surrounding lack of infrastructure to make it, a lot easier for people to move around when they get off, whether they're pedestrians, cyclists, whether they have, other ADA issues. There's just like no sidewalk. And, obviously I'm from the city of Vista. I want to be able to connect that Buena Creek Station to our business park, which is only about 2 miles away. So, the more that we can try to expand the scope of what we're trying to do at the Buena Creek Station, I think it's just going to help maximize the community benefit. So I'm very supportive of looking at connecting different type of ATP there. And ensuring that there is ADA access, maybe a little bit further from the transit station proper. So thank you. And, one of the things, since it seems like a lot of this funding, like you said, is for intercity rail, is there an ability moving forward that we would be able to look at all the buckets of funding for them to be lined up? Like this is mostly intercity rail, coaster, and then this is what the Sprinter might be eligible for. I think it'll just make it a lot easier for us to have a robust discussion and really deep dive to be able to see which buckets we're eligible for. Because the Sprinter corridor, there's a lot of different improvements that can happen there. We can reimagine what we're doing. We have the inland rail trail, right? That one day will be built all the way. I know we have funding for the Vista segment now, but so I don't know how long it will take, but at the same time, there's a lot of density happening because it's TOD, right? It's transit oriented development. So just understanding what kind of funding is available, what we can apply for, it's going to make it easier for the jurisdictions to actually come up with the dream and an implementation plan that we can then seek funding for. So anyways, I just think that would be really, really helpful. That would be my recommendation. But I appreciate all the information and the discussion that we're having. And any other questions from board members? No?
One last question. What would be an example of a project that would qualify for that mega funding?
So we actually just applied for funding. We have a pending application for the mega program for the San Diego double track project. It's a pricey project in the sense that it's double tracking a long stretch and the bridge that it would replace is about 100 years old. So that was the intention, at least for that one, larger, bigger ticket projects.
Do you have any idea how far north that project extends?
It extends into the city of Solana Beach, I believe. I don't have the exact parameters, but I can get that for you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, board members, for the robust discussion, and thank you for the presentation. There's no vote required for this item. It's informational only. So at this point, I'm just going to let you all know when our next meetings are. We have the MSBTA committee meeting. That's October 18th, 2022 at 1 p.m. And our regular board meeting, October 20th, 2022 at 2 p.m. And with that said, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.